Come get your useless daughter. I'm done with her. Those were the final words Daniel said to my mother before laughing and ending the call. Exactly 1 minute later, 6 black Cadillac Escalades turned onto our peaceful suburban street. Curtains shifted in every window. Neighbors stopped whatever they were doing. Even children riding their bikes slowed down to stare. And Daniel, the man who had just proudly divorced me, stood frozen in our driveway, divorce papers still clutched in his hand, as his entire world began collapsing around him. He had never bothered to discover who my family truly was. My name is Emily Carter, and for 12 years, I believed loving someone meant staying beside them even when they stopped standing beside you. Now I understand something I should have learned much earlier. Love should never require you to erase yourself. Daniel and I had met in Columbus, Ohio, when we were both trying to build simple lives. He was a junior sales representative at a logistics company, while I had recently earned my business degree and accepted an administrative position at a nonprofit because meaningful work mattered more to me than a fancy title. Our first apartment was tiny. The kitchen could barely accommodate 2 people. The air conditioner shook and rattled through every summer, and the neighbors upstairs seemed to argue every Friday night. Yet we were happy. We laughed constantly. Our bank accounts were small, but our dreams felt enormous. Daniel used to introduce me as his greatest blessing. He held my hand while we shopped for groceries. He kissed my forehead before work. Whenever another promotion slipped away, he thanked me for believing in him. I genuinely believed we'd grow old together. Then Daniel became successful. Not suddenly. People rarely turn into strangers overnight. Usually, it happens through 1,000 little changes. His company expanded. His salary increased. He began attending expensive business dinners and meeting executives who drove luxury cars, belonged to private clubs, and discussed investments as casually as other people discussed weekend plans. Their wives carried designer handbags. Their homes were enormous. Their vacations were extravagant. And slowly, Daniel began comparing our life to theirs. At first, the comments sounded harmless. Maybe next year we can buy something better. Then came, I wish you were more ambitious. Eventually, my boss's wife owns 2 businesses. The comparisons became criticism. The criticism became disrespect. And eventually, disrespect turned into contempt. I tried to compensate by doing more. I cooked every night, paid the bills, organized holidays, took care of family responsibilities. When Daniel's father became seriously ill, I drove him to appointments for months while Daniel buried himself in work. When Daniel couldn't sleep because of quarterly sales targets, I stayed awake beside him. When he earned promotions, I celebrated as if they were my own. But none of it seemed to matter anymore. He no longer saw what I contributed. He only saw what I lacked. You've never made 6 figures. You don't know important people. You have no ambition. Every sentence felt like another weight being placed on my shoulders. And I kept carrying them because I thought that's what a devoted wife was supposed to do. The morning our marriage ended began almost peacefully. Rain tapped against the kitchen windows. The smell of coffee filled the house. I remember thinking that maybe Daniel and I would finally sit down and have an honest conversation. Instead, he walked into the kitchen carrying a manila envelope. He dropped it on the island. It stopped directly in front of me. Divorce papers. I already signed them, he said casually. Once you sign, we're done. I stared at the envelope. 12 years, I whispered. That's all they mean to you. He shrugged. I've moved on. There was no anger in his expression, only impatience, as though I were delaying something more important. I looked around the kitchen. We'd chosen every cabinet together. Family photographs covered the walls. The dining table still had little scratches from years of carving pumpkins with our nieces. How could 12 years disappear so quietly? I thought we'd at least talk. We've talked enough. I finally looked directly into his eyes. No, Daniel. You've talked. You've judged me. You've already made your decision. He crossed his arms. I'm tired of carrying dead weight. That phrase hurt more than anything else he'd said. Dead weight. Not his wife. Not his partner. Not the woman who had stood beside him for 12 years. Just dead weight. I picked up the pen and signed. Not because I agreed with him. Because I finally understood there was nothing left to save. Daniel grabbed the papers before the ink had even dried. Then he smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the expression of someone convinced he'd just won. Then he pulled out his phone. "I'm calling your mother." I stared at him. "Why?" "So she can come collect what's hers." "Daniel, don't." He ignored me and dialed. My mother answered. "Hello." Daniel immediately switched the call to speaker. His grin widened. "Mrs. Whitmore." Silence. "Come pick up your useless daughter. I don't want her anymore." I felt my stomach tighten. Then my mother answered in the calmest voice I'd ever heard. "We'll be there in 1 minute." Click. The call ended. Daniel laughed. "Let's see what kind of junk car they arrive in." I looked down at the floor. Not because I was embarrassed. Because I already knew what was coming. There was one thing Daniel had never cared enough to investigate during our entire marriage. My family. Whenever I suggested visiting my parents, he usually declined. When my mother sent Christmas presents, he barely glanced at them. When my father invited us to charity events, Daniel always claimed he was too busy. He assumed my parents were simply comfortable retirees living outside Cleveland. He never asked what my father had done before retirement. He never wondered why my mother traveled constantly. He never questioned why our family name appeared at so many charity auctions. He simply wasn't interested. Until now. Exactly 60 seconds later, the deep roar of engines rolled through our neighborhood. Daniel frowned. "What is that?" 6 identical black Cadillac Escalades turned onto our street. They moved in perfect formation and stopped directly in front of our house. The rain had made their polished bodies shine. Several drivers stepped out wearing perfectly tailored black suits. Daniel's smile vanished. "What the hell?" The rear door of the center SUV opened. A woman wearing an elegant navy coat stepped onto the driveway. Silver hair. Perfect posture. Calm expression. My mother. She looked at me first. Not Daniel. Me. Her face softened. "My sweetheart." Then she turned toward Daniel. For several seconds, she said nothing. There was no anger in her eyes. No need for revenge. Only disappointment. One of the suited men approached her. "Everything is prepared." Daniel's eyes moved toward the embroidered logo on the man's jacket. His face suddenly lost its color. He recognized it. Whitmore Holdings. The parent company behind the investment group that controlled the company his employer belonged to. For the first time in our entire marriage, I watched genuine fear appear on Daniel's face. One of the chauffeurs stepped toward my mother. "Mrs. Whitmore, should we begin collecting Ms. Carter's belongings?" "Only her personal things," Mom answered quietly. "Everything else belongs to the past." She wasn't trying to humiliate Daniel. That wasn't my mother's style. She had always believed that dignity was more powerful than wealth. Daniel looked from her to me. "Whitmore," he whispered. Then his eyes widened. "Your last name is Whitmore." I gave him a tired smile. "I never hid it." "You never told me." "I never told you my family was poor, either." He stared at me. "No." I nodded. "No." 2 employees entered the house and began carefully packing my clothes, photographs, books, and my grandmother's quilt. As they worked, my mind wandered back through the years. Maybe because I finally understood that my marriage was truly over. Maybe because I wanted to remember the man I once loved instead of the stranger standing in front of me. Daniel and I had met nearly 13 years earlier at a community volunteer project outside Columbus. A local church was helping repair houses damaged by severe spring storms. I spent the morning painting porches. Daniel was installing drywall. By lunchtime, we were sitting on overturned buckets, sharing bottled water and peanut butter sandwiches. He made me laugh without even trying. He told me about his childhood. His father had spent 35 years working in a steel plant. His mother had been a school secretary. He dreamed of owning a home, raising children, building a stable future, and never worrying about money. Those dreams sounded remarkably similar to mine. By our 3rd date, I knew I needed to tell my parents about him. My mother smiled when I mentioned Daniel. "So, you like him?" "I do." "Does he know about us?" I looked out the kitchen window. "Not really." Dad lowered his newspaper. "Why not?" "Because I don't want him falling in love with our last name." The room became quiet. Finally, Dad nodded. "Fair enough." That decision shaped the next 12 years. I wasn't trying to deceive Daniel. I simply wanted something money couldn't buy. A relationship built on honesty. People assume wealthy families automatically live glamorous lives. Some do. Mine didn't. My grandfather founded Whitmore Freight almost 60 years ago with one used delivery truck outside Cleveland. He drove the routes himself. Loaded the shipments himself. Balanced invoices at the kitchen table. One truck became 5. 5 became 50. Then came warehouses, distribution centers, commercial properties, transportation software, and investment partnerships. Over several decades, Whitmore Freight expanded across much of the Midwest. By the time I was born, the company was worth more money than I could comprehend. But my parents refused to let wealth determine who we became. I attended public schools. I had chores. I worked summer jobs. My father insisted I learn how to balance a checking account before he taught me about investments. My mother volunteered almost every weekend. Money is only a tool, she always said. Character determines what that tool becomes. After college, Dad offered me an executive position at one of the family companies. I turned it down. I want to make my own mistakes. He laughed. Good answer. So I rented my own apartment, bought a used Honda Accord, and accepted an entry-level non-profit position that paid less than many of my classmates earned. My parents respected my independence. They didn't secretly fund my lifestyle. They didn't hand me a company. They let me build my own life. Daniel knew my parents were comfortable. He knew they traveled. He knew they supported charities. But he never bothered to ask anything beyond that. When Mom invited us to fundraising galas, he'd glance at the invitation and say, "Those events aren't really my thing." When Dad invited us to Thanksgiving, Daniel often claimed work was too demanding. When my parents sent expensive Christmas gifts, he'd smile politely before returning to his phone. Looking back, I realize he wasn't curious because he assumed there was nothing worth discovering. He judged people by appearances. And my parents had deliberately made themselves appear ordinary. The first 5 years of our marriage were genuinely happy. Then Daniel earned his first management position. His salary nearly doubled. We celebrated with takeout pizza because we still believed saving mattered. He hugged me that night. We're finally getting somewhere. I kissed him. We've always been somewhere. He smiled. I wish that version of Daniel had lasted. Instead, every promotion introduced him to people who measured success differently. His co-workers belonged to private clubs. Their spouses compared vacation homes. Every dinner became a competition. Who owned the most expensive watch? Who drove the newest SUV? Whose spouse earned the biggest salary? Daniel slowly joined the game. One evening, after corporate dinner, he came home unusually quiet. Finally, he asked, "Why don't you ever try to move up? I like what I do. You could make more money. We already have enough." He frowned. Enough isn't how successful people think. That sentence stayed with me, because it wasn't really his belief. It was something he'd learned from other people. Months later, he began criticizing my clothes. "They're too simple." Then my car. "People notice these things." Then my friends. "They aren't exactly well connected." I listened. I compromised. I bought nicer clothes. Attended networking dinners. Smiled through conversations that left me exhausted. But nothing ever satisfied him. The target kept moving. Eventually, I realized it wasn't really about money. It was about status. Daniel wanted admiration. He wanted people to envy him. And eventually, he wanted a wife who looked impressive beside him rather than a wife who genuinely loved him. Back in the driveway, one of the employees carried out 2 boxes filled with my photographs, books, and grandmother's quilt. Daniel watched silently. Then he turned toward my mother. "Mrs. Whitmore, I didn't know." Mom held his gaze. "No. You didn't tell me." "Emily never told you," Mom said carefully. "Did you ever ask?" Daniel said nothing. Because the answer was obvious. No. Not once in 12 years. He had asked co-workers about salaries, strangers about investments, neighbors about property values. But he had never asked the woman sleeping beside him about the family she came from. He thought he already knew everything that mattered. Then another black SUV turned onto the street. This time, 2 familiar people stepped out. My father came first. At 72, he was still tall and carried himself with the same quiet authority I'd known all my life. Beside him was a silver-haired man wearing a charcoal suit. Daniel stared at him. Recognition spread across his face. His breathing changed. I know him. I followed his gaze. Of course he did. The man walking toward my father was Richard Lawson, CEO of the logistics corporation where Daniel proudly worked. Richard smiled warmly and shook my father's hand. Mr. Whitmore, thank you for meeting with the board this morning. We're looking forward to finalizing the acquisition. Daniel's face went completely white. Suddenly, everything made sense to him. My family. Whitmore Holdings. His employer. The executives he'd spent years trying to impress. His career had been connected to my family all along. The rain finally stopped. The street became strangely quiet. The engines of the Escalades ticked softly as they cooled. Neighbors stood on porches, openly watching now. And Daniel stood in the middle of the driveway, divorce papers still in his hand, finally realizing that the woman he had called dead weight came from the family that was about to determine the future of the company he had sacrificed our marriage to impress. In a neighborhood like ours, people normally respected one another's privacy. But what happened that afternoon was different. This wasn't simply a divorce. It was the kind of scene people would remember and talk about for years. Daniel stood motionless, staring at Richard Lawson, the executive he'd spent years trying desperately to impress. Richard warmly shook my father's hand before turning toward me. Emily. He smiled. It's wonderful to see you again. It's good to see you too, Richard. Daniel looked between us, completely confused. You know each other. Richard laughed softly. I've known Emily since she was a teenager. Daniel's eyes widened. What? My father calmly explained. Richard served on our Scholarship Foundation's board long before he became CEO. Daniel slowly turned toward me. You've met him before. Many times. He looked as though he'd suddenly become physically ill. I don't understand. No, I answered quietly. I imagine you don't. Richard politely shifted his attention back to my father. The acquisition paperwork is almost finished. Dad nodded. Excellent. We should have everything completed by next week. Daniel couldn't contain himself. Acquisition. Richard looked at him with mild curiosity. Yes. Your company is becoming part of Whitmore Holdings. Daniel's lips parted. I work there. I know. Richard's voice remained completely professional. You're the regional sales director. Daniel nodded mechanically. Richard gave him a polite smile. Your sales numbers have been strong. For a moment, hope returned to Daniel's face. Then Richard continued. However, I've also been informed that your division has had unusually high employee turnover. Daniel's shoulders tightened. There have been several HR complaints as well. Nobody spoke. Daniel swallowed. Richard wasn't threatening him. He was simply presenting facts. And somehow, those facts sounded much more serious than they had the day before. My father placed a hand gently on Richard's shoulder. We'll discuss business on Monday. Of course. Richard nodded, then looked at Daniel one final time. I hope everything works out for you personally. Then he walked away. No threats. No intimidation. Just professionalism. That somehow made the situation even more uncomfortable. Daniel turned toward my father. Mr. Whitmore. Dad looked at him patiently. Yes. I didn't know Emily came from. He couldn't finish. Dad gave him a faint smile. You didn't know because you never made the effort to know. Daniel lowered his eyes. 12 years, Daniel, Dad continued quietly. 12 years, and you never once asked how I built my career. Daniel said nothing. You never asked Emily about her childhood. You never wondered why we insisted she create a life of her own. Dad paused. You decided who we were without ever taking the time to find out. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. I made a mistake. Dad nodded. Yes, you certainly did. One of the assistants approached me quietly. Ms. Carter. Yes. Your belongings have been packed. I looked toward the front entrance. Everything I truly cared about fit into 6 medium-sized boxes. Photographs. My grandmother's quilt. Books. A few personal keepsakes. Some clothes. That was it. For 12 years, I'd shared an entire life with Daniel, yet so little of that life actually belonged to me. Perhaps that was the saddest realization of all. I picked up the first box. Daniel instinctively stepped forward. I'll carry it. I looked at him. For years, I would have accepted his help. But not that day. No, thank you. His hand slowly fell back to his side. As another employee placed my belongings inside one of the SUVs, Daniel followed me across the driveway. Emily. I kept walking. Please. I stopped. Not because I wanted to continue the conversation, but because after 12 years together, I felt he deserved one final opportunity to speak honestly. I was angry, he said, his voice shaking. You called my mother. I know. You called me useless. I know. You told her to come collect me like I was some unwanted piece of furniture. Tears filled his eyes. I know. I studied his face, searching for excuses or blame. Instead, I saw fear. Not fear of losing me. Fear of losing everything he'd just discovered. That realization hurt more than his insults ever had. If my parents had arrived in an old pickup truck, I asked quietly, would you still be apologizing? Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He didn't need to answer. We both knew the truth. Several neighbors suddenly became very interested in their mailboxes and lawns, even though they were obviously listening. An elderly woman across the street looked genuinely heartbroken. She had watched Daniel and me plant flowers together every spring. She had brought casseroles after his father's death. She remembered the couple we used to be. Sometimes I wished I could remember us that way too. My mother approached and gently squeezed my hand. Are you ready? I nodded. Almost. She stepped away without saying anything else. She knew I needed to close this chapter on my own. Daniel took a slow step toward me. I loved you. I gave him a sad smile. I believe you did. A flicker of hope appeared in his eyes. But somewhere along the way, I continued, you started loving success more. His eyes dropped. You stopped seeing me. You became embarrassed by me. You wanted a wife who looked expensive. Each sentence landed softly, not as revenge, as truth. I was standing beside you the entire time, I said. But you kept looking past me, searching for someone better. His tears finally fell. I'm sorry. For the first time that morning, I believed him. But sincere regret doesn't erase consequences. I hope someday you become the man I married, I said. Because the man standing here today. I looked around the driveway. Isn't him. Daniel covered his face. I took one final breath. Then I said the words I knew he'd remember forever. You didn't lose a wealthy wife today. He looked up. You lost the woman who loved you before success ever mattered. The words hung over the quiet street. Nobody moved. Even the neighbors looked away. Not because I had been cruel. Because the truth was painful. I climbed into the SUV beside my mother. Just before the door closed, Daniel hurried forward. Emily. I looked back. I never cheated on you. For a moment, I didn't understand why he thought that mattered. As though remaining faithful physically excused everything else. I know, I said. But respect is part of marriage too. The door closed. The convoy slowly pulled away. As we turned the corner, I looked through the tinted window. Daniel remained alone in the driveway. The divorce papers had fallen from his hand. Rainwater pushed them slowly across the pavement. For the first time, he looked very small. We drove in silence for almost 20 minutes. Eventually, Mom reached over and took my hand. Are you okay? I stared through the window. I don't know. She nodded. That's an honest answer. I swallowed. I keep wondering if I failed. Mom smiled gently. No. You loved someone completely. That is never failure. A few miles later, the convoy entered downtown Columbus. Instead of heading toward one of my parents' homes, the lead SUV turned beneath the covered entrance of an elegant historic hotel overlooking the Scioto River. Employees were already waiting. One approached my mother, Mrs. Whitmore. Another turned toward me with a warm smile. Welcome home, Ms. Carter. Home. The word felt strange. But for the first time that day, it also felt possible. I stepped from the SUV without realizing that my life was about to begin again. And I certainly didn't know that Daniel's greatest losses were only beginning. People love stories where karma happens overnight. The arrogant husband loses everything. The betrayed wife becomes wealthy. Justice arrives immediately. Real life isn't usually that simple. At least mine wasn't. What happened after the divorce wasn't dramatic. It was quieter, and in many ways, more painful. 3 weeks after I left our house, my attorney called. "Emily, we've received another proposal from Daniel's lawyer." I was sitting in a conference room at the Whitmore Foundation, reviewing grant applications designed to help women leaving difficult marriages rebuild their lives. I leaned back. What does he want? He wants to reopen the property settlement. I wasn't surprised. He signed everything voluntarily. I know. He's claiming he wasn't fully aware of certain financial circumstances. I nearly laughed. You mean he didn't know my parents were wealthy? There was a short silence. That's essentially his argument. I closed the folder in front of me. We're not changing anything. I thought you'd say that. My attorney hesitated. Emily, your parents aren't asking us to pursue anything against him. I know. They specifically instructed us not to make this more difficult for him. I smiled. That sounded exactly like Mom and Dad. Even after everything, they refused to turn their wealth into a weapon. And contrary to what people might have assumed, Whitmore Holdings never deliberately interfered with Daniel's career. My father made that clear during the first executive meeting after the acquisition. Richard later told me what happened. Dad had looked around the boardroom and said only one thing. We judge employees by performance, not personal history. That rule applied to everyone, including my ex-husband. If Daniel succeeded, he would earn that success himself. If he failed, that responsibility would belong to him alone. Unfortunately, his career had already begun deteriorating long before our divorce. Without someone quietly keeping his personal life organized, the cracks became impossible to hide. He missed meetings. Deadlines slipped. He became impatient with employees. One regional manager transferred after filing a complaint about his leadership. Then another. Within 6 months, 4 experienced employees had resigned. Richard didn't fire Daniel. Instead, his expected promotion was postponed repeatedly. Eventually, someone else received the position. Not because of my family. Because leadership requires more than impressive sales numbers. It requires people who actually want to follow you. Daniel no longer had that. I heard pieces of the story through mutual acquaintances. The expensive downtown apartment he'd rented after our divorce became difficult for him to maintain. His luxury SUV disappeared. His country club membership quietly expired. The co-workers who once invited him to exclusive dinners stopped calling. It wasn't really cruelty. It was simply reality. Many of those friendships had been built around status. When the status disappeared, so did the friendships. Years earlier, I told Daniel that real friends wouldn't care what kind of car he drove. He'd laughed. I know who my friends are. Eventually, he learned the difference. The woman he'd begun seeing shortly before our divorce stayed with him for less than 4 months. I never learned the complete story. Honestly, I didn't want to. One afternoon, an old neighbor called. I thought you should know. You don't have to tell me. No, Emily. You deserve to hear this. Apparently, the woman packed her belongings while Daniel was at work. She left behind a handwritten note. It said, "You're not the man you pretended to be." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Meanwhile, my own life felt strangely unfamiliar. During the first month after the divorce, I woke up at 6 every morning. I'd instinctively reach toward the other side of the bed. Then reality would return. Some mornings I cried. Other mornings, I simply stared at the ceiling. Healing isn't a straight road. Anyone who says it is has probably never truly lost someone they loved. My mother never pressured me to recover quickly. She would knock softly on my apartment door inside the family guest house. Breakfast. Sometimes I joined her. Sometimes I didn't. Either way, she understood. Dad had his own quiet method of helping. Every Friday afternoon, he invited me to lunch. Never to discuss Daniel. Never to discuss business. We talked about baseball, fishing, books, and childhood memories. Without saying it directly, He reminded me that my identity had never depended on being someone's wife. About 2 months after the divorce, Mom walked into my apartment carrying a folder. "I have a question." I looked up from a novel I hadn't really been reading. "I'm listening." She placed the folder on the coffee table. "The foundation wants to expand." Inside were plans for a new program offering emergency housing, career counseling, financial education, and legal support for women rebuilding their lives after difficult marriages. "I'd like you to lead it." I stared at her. "Mom, you've lived through none of this yourself." "I'm not sure I'm ready." She smiled. "No one ever feels ready." I studied the proposal. Finally, I asked, "Why me?" She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Because pain can make us bitter." She paused. "Or it can make us useful." Those words stayed with me. I accepted the position the following week. The work transformed me. Every day, I met women whose stories humbled me. A nurse whose husband emptied their savings account. A grandmother raising 3 grandchildren after her daughter disappeared. A military spouse abandoned during cancer treatment. A teacher escaping years of emotional manipulation. Compared with some of their experiences, my own situation seemed easier. Yet every woman carried the same invisible burden. They believed they weren't enough. Week after week, I watched that belief begin to disappear. One woman found her first apartment. Another started nursing school at 46. Another opened a small bakery. Their victories taught me something important. Starting over isn't failure. It's courage. My therapist noticed the change before I did. During one session, she smiled. "You haven't mentioned Daniel once today." I blinked. She was right. For nearly an hour, we'd talked about my future instead of my past. "What does that mean?" "It means your story is becoming bigger than your pain." I left her office that afternoon feeling lighter than I had in years. Forgiveness hadn't arrived. But freedom had begun. Nearly 10 months after the divorce, Dad invited me to dinner. After dessert, he switched on the television. The local news had just started. A reporter stood outside our newest community resource center. Behind her was a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Then my face appeared on the screen. The reporter smiled at the camera. "Emily Carter, director of the New Beginnings Initiative, has helped more than 200 women secure stable housing and employment during the program's first year." They showed interviews with several women I'd worked with. One wiped away tears. "Emily never treated us like broken people." Another smiled. She reminded me that I still had value. I felt embarrassed watching myself on television. Dad looked incredibly proud. Mom quietly reached for another napkin, trying to hide the tears in her eyes. Across town, in a small apartment, Daniel happened to be watching the same broadcast. A mutual acquaintance later told me that he never changed the channel. He simply sat there and watched until the program ended. It wasn't because Daniel was jealous of my success. For the first time, he simply saw the woman he had ignored for 12 years. And he finally understood that the greatest thing he'd lost had never been money, status, or a comfortable life. It was the woman who had stood beside him faithfully when he had nothing. For a long time, I thought revenge meant watching someone suffer. I imagined Daniel losing his career, his reputation, his confidence, and everything he had once considered important. I imagined him experiencing even a small portion of the loneliness he'd left behind. But during the second year after our divorce, something unexpected happened. My anger began to disappear. Not because Daniel suddenly deserved forgiveness. Because I was exhausted from carrying resentment. It felt like dragging a suitcase full of rocks everywhere I went. Eventually, I understood something. The divorce had already taken enough from me. I wasn't going to let bitterness steal anything else. Almost 18 months after our marriage ended, an email appeared in my inbox from someone I never expected to hear from again. The subject line was simple. "I owe you an apology." I stared at it for several minutes before opening it. There were no dramatic declarations. No request to reunite. No excuses. Just a few honest paragraphs. "Emily, I know I have no right to ask anything from you. I'm not writing because I expect forgiveness. I'm writing because I've finally become honest enough to admit what I did. For years, I blamed everyone except myself. You deserved a husband who respected you. Instead, I made you feel invisible. If you're willing, I'd appreciate 10 minutes of your time someday. If not, I'll understand." I read it 3 times. Then I closed my laptop without responding. A week later, I mentioned the email during lunch with my parents. Dad quietly spread butter across another piece of bread. Mom listened without interrupting. "What do you think?" I finally asked. Dad shrugged. "Only you can decide." Mom nodded. "You don't owe him a meeting." "I know." She smiled gently. "But you're wondering whether hearing him might help you close the final door." Exactly. That was what I couldn't explain. I didn't miss my marriage. I didn't want Daniel back. But there was one conversation our story had never had. 2 days later, I replied. 1 hour. Saturday. 10 a.m. Jefferson Coffee on Main Street. Nothing more. His answer arrived within 5 minutes. "Thank you." Jefferson Coffee looked almost exactly the same as I remembered. It was the kind of independent cafe where the owner knew regular customers by name. The wooden floors creaked beneath every step. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room, and local artwork covered the brick walls. It felt safe, public, neutral. I arrived first out of habit. At exactly 10 o'clock, the front door opened. For a second, I barely recognized Daniel. He looked older than 43. Not because of gray hair. Because of humility. The expensive tailored suits were gone. Instead, he wore dark jeans, work boots, and a simple blue shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. Even the way he carried himself had changed. He no longer looked like a man desperate to impress everyone around him. He looked like someone afraid of disappointing them. When he reached my table, he didn't attempt to hug me. He didn't even offer his hand. "Thank you for coming." I nodded. "You have 1 hour." He sat down. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. "I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times, he finally said. "I figured." He gave a nervous smile. Every version sounded like an excuse. "Then don't make excuses." "I won't." The waitress brought our coffee. Neither of us touched it. Daniel folded his hands together. "The first thing I need to tell you is simple." He looked directly into my eyes. I was emotionally abusive. The words surprised me. Not because they were untrue. Because he said them without hesitation. "I used to tell myself I wasn't," he continued. "I thought because I never physically hurt you, I wasn't hurting you. I was wrong." I remained silent. I criticized everything. Your clothes. Your career. Your friends. I made you feel like you were never enough. He slowly inhaled. "And the worst part is that you kept trying harder." Suddenly, those years came rushing back. The new clothes. The different hairstyles. The networking events I hated. The extra effort at home. The constant smiling. The endless apologies. I had spent years trying to become worthy of the man I loved. Only much later did I realize I had never been the one who needed to change. Daniel reached inside his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I brought something." He slid it across the table. It wasn't a letter. It was a photograph. Our first apartment. Someone had taken it during our second Christmas together. We were standing beside a tiny artificial Christmas tree decorated with mismatched ornaments. Neither of us wore expensive clothes. Neither of us cared about appearances. We looked happy. "I found it while packing," Daniel said quietly. I stared at it for hours. I looked at the picture. "What did you see?" He swallowed. "Me." Before ambition turned into arrogance. He told me he'd been attending counseling for nearly a year. Not because anyone forced him. Because he had finally become tired of blaming everyone else. His therapist had asked him a question that changed his perspective. "When was the last time you admitted you were wrong without adding the word 'but' afterward?" Daniel couldn't answer. He realized almost every apology he'd ever given sounded like, "I'm sorry, but you." Or, "I'm sorry, but work has been stressful." Or, "I'm sorry, but everyone else does it." He had almost never simply said, "I'm sorry." Counseling forced him to examine something deeper than our failed marriage. His obsession with approval. His need to look successful. His fear that being ordinary meant being worthless. "The irony," he said quietly, "is that I spent years chasing respect and ended up losing the respect of the one person who gave it to me freely." Then he looked at me. "I'm not asking you to come back." Good. I know we're finished. I appreciated that. So why did you ask me to meet? He took a deep breath. Because I couldn't keep pretending I was the victim. Silence settled between us. Then he continued. I called your mother. Yes. I called you useless. Yes. I've hated myself for saying that ever since. He wiped his eyes. I needed you to know that. I watched him for a long moment. Then I asked the question I'd carried for nearly 2 years. Tell me honestly, if my family had been poor, would you still have left me? He closed his eyes. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then his voice came quietly. Yes. The answer hurt. But strangely, it also brought peace. Because it confirmed something important. Our marriage hadn't ended because of money. It ended because his character had been deteriorating long before either of us fully recognized it. Thank you, I whispered. Thank you for finally telling me the truth. When we stood to leave, Daniel reached for the check. I smiled. We'll split it. He nodded. Fair enough. Outside, autumn leaves moved across the sidewalk in the cool breeze. Before we went our separate ways, I stopped. I forgive you. Daniel stared at me in shock. I didn't say I've forgotten, I continued. And I didn't say what happened was acceptable. I took a breath. I forgive you because I don't want to carry it anymore. Tears rolled down his face. I don't deserve that. No, I said honestly. You don't. He looked at me. But forgiveness isn't something you earn. I paused. It's something I choose. A week later, Daniel asked whether he could apologize to my parents. To my surprise, they agreed. The meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. Dad listened quietly. Mom accepted his apology with the same grace she'd shown the day she arrived with those 6 black SUVs. Before Daniel left, she gave him one final piece of advice. Daniel. He looked up. Never measure another person's worth by what they own. She smiled gently. Character always reveals itself eventually. He nodded through his tears. As he walked away, I realized something. For the first time since our divorce, neither of us was leaving angry. We were simply walking toward different futures. 3 years can change a person in ways you never expect. Not through one dramatic event. Through thousands of small decisions. Small lessons. Small acts of courage repeated until one day you realize you aren't the person you used to be. When I think about the woman who sat in that kitchen signing divorce papers, she feels almost like a stranger. She was kind. She was loyal. But she believed her worth depended on whether someone else chose her. The woman I became finally understood the truth. My value had never been something another person could decide. The New Beginnings initiative grew far beyond what I'd imagined. What began as a small program serving women in Central Ohio expanded into neighboring counties. Then another state joined. Then another. We never set out to become famous. We wanted to become useful. Every week, I met women who reminded me of the person I used to be. Some had survived financial abuse. Some had endured years of emotional manipulation. Some arrived carrying children and almost nothing else. Others carried expensive handbags while hiding wounds nobody could see. Pain doesn't care about income. Neither does hope. One afternoon, a woman in her late 50s stayed behind after a financial planning workshop. I almost didn't come, she admitted. Why? She smiled nervously. I thought everyone here would be younger. I laughed softly. Starting over doesn't have an age limit. Her eyes filled with tears. My husband left after 32 years. She looked around the room. I don't even know who I am anymore. I reached across the table and held her hand. I do. She looked confused. You're someone who's still here. I smiled. And that's where rebuilding begins. A year later, she sent me a Christmas card. She had opened a small accounting business. At the bottom, she wrote one sentence I'll never forget. Thank you for reminding me that life wasn't over just because one chapter ended. I kept that card inside my desk. Whenever I questioned whether our work mattered, I read it again. Eventually, my parents began stepping away from the daily operations of the family business. Dad finally admitted he preferred fishing to board meetings. Mom joked that retirement simply meant fewer meetings and more volunteering. One spring afternoon, The three of us sat on their porch overlooking a quiet lake outside Cleveland. Dad leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said, smiling, "your grandfather would have been proud." "Because of the business?" Dad laughed. "No. Because you remembered why he built it." I frowned. "I thought he built it to provide for the family." "He did." Dad nodded toward a newspaper lying on the table. "But not only for us." The article featured one of our scholarship recipients, a single father who had returned to school in his 40s and eventually become an engineer. Dad pointed toward the photograph. "Your grandfather used to say money only keeps its value when it keeps helping people." I looked across the lake. For the first time, I truly understood what my parents had spent my entire life teaching me. Wealth wasn't measured by the number in a bank account. It was measured by how many lives became lighter because you were here. People sometimes ask whether I ever fell in love again. I did. His name was Michael. He was a high school history teacher and a widower raising a teenage daughter. We met at one of our community fundraising events. He wasn't there to donate. His students had organized a volunteer project for our program. The first thing I noticed wasn't his smile. It was the way he listened. When someone spoke, he actually paid attention. Months later, during one of our first dates, I nervously told him everything about my marriage. When I finished, I apologized. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For bringing all this baggage." He reached across the table and gently took my hand. "Emily." His voice was warm. "Your past explains you. It doesn't reduce your value." Such a simple sentence. Yet no one had ever said anything like that to me before. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony surrounded by family, close friends, and many women whose lives had crossed mine through new beginnings. There were no extravagant decorations. No magazine photographers. Just laughter, children running across the lawn, homemade pie, and a string quartet from the local university. It was everything my first wedding hadn't been. Peaceful. Authentic. Enough. Daniel's life became quieter too. Not perfect. Just more honest. Richard Lawson eventually told me that Daniel had voluntarily stepped away from management. Instead of chasing executive promotions, he'd accepted a position training newly hired sales representatives. At first, Richard thought the decision was strange. Then he watched Daniel work. Apparently, he'd become remarkably patient. He listened. He encouraged people. He admitted his mistakes. One day, a young employee asked him how to become successful. Daniel reportedly answered, "Don't confuse admiration with respect. They're not the same thing." Richard laughed when he told me. I think he's finally figured it out. I believed he had. Every Thanksgiving, our foundation hosted a community dinner for families going through difficult seasons. Volunteers served meals. Children decorated cookies. Local musicians played old American songs. 3 years after our divorce, I looked across the room while greeting guests. And there was Daniel. He wore a volunteer apron and was serving mashed potatoes to an elderly veteran. There was no awkwardness. No bitterness. When he noticed me, he walked over. "Hi, Emily." "Hi, Daniel." "Looks like we both stayed busy." "We did." He glanced around the crowded room. "I never thanked you." "For what?" "For forgiving me." I smiled. "I didn't do it for you." "I know." He nodded. "You did it for yourself." Then he looked toward the families eating together. And maybe it gave me permission to become someone better too. I didn't answer immediately. Some moments don't require many words. I simply smiled. Then we returned to serving dinner. 2 people whose lives had once been defined by pain were now quietly helping strangers. That felt like the ending our story deserved. People still ask about the day my mother arrived with 6 black SUVs. They expect me to say that was the moment everything changed. They're only partly right. That convoy revealed the truth. But it didn't create it. The real turning point came much later. It happened when I stopped measuring my worth through someone else's opinion. When Daniel finally accepted responsibility without excuses. When forgiveness became stronger than revenge. If you've stayed with my story this long, I hope you remember this. Never underestimate a quiet person. Never judge someone's value by what you can see. The richest people aren't always the ones with the largest houses or most expensive cars. They're the people whose character remains intact when nobody is watching. And if someone ever makes you feel small, remember, their inability to recognize your worth does not reduce it. Not then. Not now. Not ever. Thank you for spending this time with me and allowing me to share one of the hardest chapters of my life. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of someone you love, or gave you the courage to begin again, share it with someone who may need to hear it. And if you'd like more stories about resilience, forgiveness, and finding strength after life's hardest moments, stay with me for the next chapter.